It feels strange to say that Mission Impossible has now come to an end, especially in this day and age where nothing truly stays dead. Your franchise could end in the most conclusive and satisfying way imaginable, but that's not going to stop corporate greed from reviving the decaying corpse of a franchise just to try and earn a few extra billion from it before everyone inevitably gets sick of it. However, with Mission Impossible, it feels like they're ending it at the right time. The franchise peaked with Fallout, and has been on a steady decline in quality ever since. Not to say that Dead and Final Reckoning are bad movies, I do enjoy them both, but there's only so much you can do with this franchise before it becomes bland and stale. While I am aware that originally, it was implied by Christopher McQuarrie back in 2023 that they were planning on doing more Mission Impossible movies after their planned two-parter, it's been confirmed now by Tom Cruise that this will indeed be the final one, which most likely had to do with Dead Reckoning not doing so well in the box office, among other reasons I may not be aware of. Whatever the case may be, we are now left with the final installment in the franchise, Dead Reckoning, a movie that I honestly don't know how to articulate my feelings with properly. I definitely had a fun time, but the flaws in this movie certainly stick out like a sore thumb. The most offensive one out of them all would be the pacing in the first act. Good God, it is atrocious. This movie feels the need to constantly cram in as much exposition as possible, as well as providing an inordinate amount of flashbacks to the previous movies in the franchise. Now, I am fully aware that a Mission Impossible movie, being needlessly self-indulgent and convoluted, is kind of what it's partly known for. But in this particular case, it's less charming in the way that it's trying to be a fun spy thriller, and more frustrating as it gives off the impression that the movie thinks that its audience is brain dead. The movie will either repeat information from what they've already told us in previous movies, or will convey it in an extremely clunky manner. It constantly derails any kind of flow the pacing has going for it in the first act, to be interrupted with either bad exposition or needlessly pointless flashbacks. I'm a bit more forgiving of this issue since this is the final movie, and a lot of information needs to be communicated to the audience, but it's clear to me that they had no idea how they would execute this, not to mention the editing. I briefly mentioned how the flashbacks within the movie heavily disrupted the flow, and that is partly related to my issue with this movie's editing within the first act. We are not only given a needless amount of unnecessary flashbacks that the audience would have been able to figure out on their own from the dialogue, but the way it's also structured within the editing is horrendous. The film constantly cuts from one scene to the other without giving it time to breathe, which can lead to some pretty jarring transitions. Sometimes a scene will cut to another location in the first act without much warning, and the whiplash that comes from it is not fun at all. I also rewatched this movie the day after seeing it, to see if my opinion would change on this movie's less than stellar first act, but it only ended up being worse for me. So I decided to rewatch Mission Impossible Fallout to see if the movie had a similar effect, but instead I was left with the complete opposite reaction compared to Dead Reckoning. I finished the movie feeling quite satisfied with its structure. Each story beat and action sequence flows smoothly into the next, without giving the impression that the movie is wasting your time. Thankfully, after the first act, the movie picks up and is paced way better in its second and third acts. Other than that, the movie is essentially perfect pacing-wise, but when it comes to the plot, on the other hand, it isn't perfect. But like I said earlier, since it's a final entry into the series, I'm a bit more forgiving, considering how hard it is to make a satisfying conclusion that is coherent in its narrative. Although I do find it quite insane that throughout its 30-year lifespan, the only bad Mission Impossible movie we've gotten is the second one. Every other movie in the franchise has ranged from either good to great. Not to mention that unlike most action spy thrillers, Mission Impossible has a great story and characterization that is engaging throughout. And I adore how the characterization in the franchise is expanded upon in each film. For example, in the first movie, Ethan's team is killed and he is the only one who makes it out, leaving him with some form of survivor's guilt. So throughout each of the future installments, he makes an effort to at times put the team first over his mission, not to mention his hatred for killing innocents, while best utilized in Fallout, is showcased in almost every movie to display who Ethan is at his core. Sure, the story and character writing for the franchise isn't the most complex or complicated, but I mean it's still good writing nonetheless. Other than the wonky structure and decently constructive narrative, we are blessed with some of the best action within the Mission Impossible franchise. I can criticize this movie for a lot of things, but the one thing that Mission Impossible will always be great at is its action. In some of the trailers for the movie, you may have seen Tom Cruise hanging onto the side of a plane for dear life, and when I saw it in the ads I thought I'd practically seen the entire stunt, but I was sorely mistaken. This stunt goes on for a good 10 minutes and is by far the best action set piece within the franchise. When I got to this part in the movie, I was on the edge of my seat the entire time, where it felt like I was practically there with Ethan, not to mention the Sevastopol sequence in the movie, which is probably the most creative Mission Impossible has gone with its action sequences. That entire section of the movie brought a new level of tension and almost felt like a horror movie in a way, with its almost Lovecraftian-esque music that plays during the scene. This and the biplane sequence are one of the biggest reasons as to why you should see this movie. Say what you want about Tom Cruise, but the man's commitment to the craft is almost inspiring in a way. Hell, he once broke his foot during the filming of Fallout, and instead of cutting there to try and recover from his injury, he continued on with the scene. His preference for doing his own stunts and filming things practically is what separates his films from your average generic action movie. The guy is an absolute madman and has my respect in that regard. The cinematography is also a massive plus, although unsurprising considering how great the other movies Christopher McQuarrie has worked on in the franchise. However, despite the fact that all of these movies have been directed by the same director, they all feel quite visually diverse from one another. Although weirdly enough, I never hear anyone talk about the visuals in these movies, despite how incredible they all are. They always find a way to try and get creative with its style, and use that style to create tension within the film, and Final Reckoning is no different. There are some seriously beautiful shots in this movie that looked gorgeous in IMAX, and the continued use of practical effects largely benefits these movies, as the use of environments and stunts only helped with my immersion and love for these films, instead of deciding to go the route of replacing everything with a green screen. Not to say that all green screens or VFX are bad, but when it comes to something like a Mission Impossible movie, that type of technology should be used as minimally as possible. Not to mention the aspect ratio changes in this movie were amazing. I think it only happened about 3 times, but when it did, it was a transcendent experience. The same can be said about the music. The music for Mission Impossible is usually nothing short of fantastic, but I want to hammer home just how great the soundtrack for this movie really is. The reuse of musical motifs isn't just for the sake of nostalgia, though that certainly plays a part. It helps give the film a sense of cohesion, like all of the past missions are leading to this one culminating moment. A great example of Mission Impossible bringing back certain motifs from the previous movies are the bongos, which featured prominently in Fallout. It's subtle, but if you've been following the series, it stands out. There's a rhythmic familiarity there that adds both tension and continuity. In fact, certain notes from Fallout and other Mission Impossible movies are frequently used in very creative ways to make an original yet familiar soundtrack, like this one here. Of course, there are many examples I could use where certain parts of each track borrow from the soundtracks preceding it, but you get the idea at this point. Because of this, it helps the tracks become a lot more memorable. Unlike many other action movies where their soundtracks can be extremely generic and forgettable, but with Mission Impossible I am never disappointed with how the music turns out, and Final Reckoning is no exception. Especially the track that plays during the Sevastopol section, which is by far the best track in the movie, that aided with the terror you felt as Ethan traversed through the remains of the Sevastopol, with elements of the entity's theme being added in as quite a cool touch all things considered. As a whole, the movie's soundtrack truly captures the finality and emotional weight of the film, while still making it feel fresh, which also brings a level of intensity to the film that matches its energy during its more high-octane moments. It's really good stuff. But before we end the video here, there are a couple more things I'd like to cover that are spoiler related. So if you haven't seen Final Reckoning yet, either skip to the timecode on screen, or pause the video and come back once you've seen it. This will be covering heavy spoilers, so don't say I didn't warn you. Spoilers inbound in 3, 2, 1. Earlier in the video, I briefly touched on the movie's plot, but because I had to restrict most of it to non-spoilers, I figured now would be the best time to discuss what works and doesn't work with the plot. Starting with the characters, we are introduced to a few new ones, which are Rolf Saxon, reprising his role of the guy who found Ethan Hunt's knife from the first movie, Tramell Tillman, who basically plays Seth Milchick from Severance, but if he ran a submarine instead of the severed floor, and this guy. Yeah, I don't remember him either. While I did find the inclusion of Rolf Saxon's character to be a bit jarring at first, as I thought they were only going to use him as one of those, oh, remember this character? Remember the first Mission Impossible movie? It turns out he had a far bigger role to play for the movie, and Ethan's character as a whole. It's quite nice to see that we get a more physical manifestation in a way, for all the people that Ethan has helped. Especially at that point in the movie, where Ethan is at one of his lowest points in the franchise, after losing Luther. So knowing that his work does make a difference, and that there are some people out there who are better off for having known him, was quite a nice touch to end the franchise on. However, despite the amount of good we get with Ethan's character, we also get some bad. The most egregious of them all is when Ethan decides to get into the coffin with the entity, which has to be one of the most illogical things he's ever done in the franchise. That is not in line with his character at all, and from what Ethan has been shown with the entity's capabilities of mass media manipulation and so much more, he would have no reason in the slightest to get into a little coffin tomb thing with it. Which leads me to my next issue with the film, that being the entity itself, who has taken more of a backseat role for the movie, despite how often Ethan interacts with him in Dead Reckoning. It almost makes the entity's defeat more anticlimactic than anything. While we did get the threat of what the entity can do throughout the movie, there is a shocking lack of confrontation with what is supposed to be the movie's main villain. I'm not saying that he needs to have a constant presence throughout the movie, but a final scene with him at the end would have been nice. Instead, the movie's main villain is the entity's meat puppet, Gabriel, who is by far the worst antagonist in the Mission Impossible franchise. He was largely incompetent in Dead Reckoning, and in Final Reckoning he is no different, as his plan largely hinges on Ethan and his gang simply giving him what he wants. I get that Ethan is very competent, but it's quite a lot to hinge your plan on a guy who has a very high chance of dying in the process. Not to mention that when Gabriel tries to escape Ethan, he casually tells him about the backup plane, which leads me to question even further why he would even need a backup plane, other than to give Ethan a way to defeat the villain by the end of it all. It's all pretty flimsy, and it makes me wish we had stuck with the entity as the main antagonist for the movie, as I thoroughly enjoyed his dynamic with Ethan in Dead Reckoning, as he proved to be quite the neat foil to him at points throughout the film, and it's a shame he wasn't utilized further. The final thing I'd like to talk about is Luther, a character who has been with Mission Impossible since the beginning, and is killed off within the first act of the film. My feelings on this are mixed. On one hand, I adore the ending monologue that Luther gives, talking about Ethan. It's not only extremely heartfelt, but makes the victory against the entity and Gabriel feel more earned in the film's climax, and gives Ethan the send-off he deserves. But on the other hand, the journey the movie takes to get to Luther dying is a little weird. I'm fine with Gabriel deciding to kill Luther, it's something that he would do given the circumstances, and the way he goes out by sacrificing himself to save an entire city is heroic and a fitting death for him. But it only makes me wonder why they bothered making him ill and bedridden. It doesn't even make sense considering how Final Reckoning is supposed to take place 2 months after Dead Reckoning, to which Luther has suddenly gained this mystery illness between Dead and Final Reckoning. Not only has he gained this illness off-screen, but it is heavily implied to be killing him. Not to say that it isn't possible, but the chances of it happening are quite unlikely. Unfortunately, that's not the only issue I have with the 2-month time jump, as I have no idea what Ethan has been doing this entire time to stop the entity. But despite my many disappointments with Final Reckoning, at the end of the day I'm still mostly satisfied overall. While the narrative wasn't always great, the way the film ends is fantastic, and leaves it on a note that feels more like a love letter to the franchise as a whole. As someone who has grown up with this franchise, I can't lie when I say it's sad to see it go, but I'm glad that it went out with a bang rather than having the franchise spin its wheels for years on end, until it becomes a husk of the thing you once fell in love with. So if you haven't seen Final Reckoning yet, I'd recommend it, but do beware that it's not without its massive flaws. Unless that's what the entity wants me to think. Thank you all so much for watching. This video went on a little longer than I had originally intended, but there was a lot I wanted to get out of the way, and considering this is the final Mission Impossible movie we'll ever be getting, I figured that the film deserved it. And if you liked my little review / analysis of Final Reckoning, then be sure to support me by liking the video, sharing it around, and subscribing to the channel. It really does help me out a lot. So thank you all once again, and I'll see you all in the next video. Take care, y'all. Bye.